Hello. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ahmed Tharwat, the host of Billah Dawn. And if there is a story about Egypt, and we are there, I'm as an Egyptian myself, was born in Egypt long time ago. I've always intrigued about a story coming and how people, non-Egyptian, think of Egypt. And usually the Americans and West in general are fascinated by dead Egyptian. When they go to Egypt, they relate to her and antiquity and talk to Zahar Hawass and interested to see mummies and all dead Egyptian, go to the museum, pyramids, take pictures and send it. That's the extent of it. But the story today really about somebody, he got interested in a very basic aspect of Egyptian life. She was a graduate student that went in 26 or 27 and to field study about security and water and all of that. And she stumbled to the idea of how Egyptian relate to bread and talked about bread as life in Egypt. That's how they call bread in Egypt, aish in Arabic, Egyptian Arabic. Means living or aish, and bread is ingrained in Egyptian life and identity, and baladi bread, the Frangi bread, and bread coming from the village, and a bread in the bakery, and the standing in line, rights, and 77. The year I left Egypt, there was riots. They call it bread riots, and Sadat almost lost his butt there. And in 2011, the chanting in Tahrir Square was عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, bread, freedom, and social justice. And bread can mean literally economic security, and also symbolically means living, means kind of the freedom to live and freedom of living. And that I think that more was what they meant in Tahrir Square in 2011, because I was there. Most of the people were middle class. They were not starving. Anyway, our guest today, Professor Jessica Barnes, and she wrote a book about bread in Egypt, and of course, you're going to see the opposite of it for some reason. So let's not do that. A stable security, bread and wheat in Egypt, and this is book detail, ethnography of the daily life of Egypt and how Egyptians relate to bread and what it means to them as far as their living and life and relationship between the government and bread and the people, and the difference between rural and villages, and how that homemade bread in the village and the city bread, baladi bread that make in the bakery and people buy it standing in line and all of that. It's a very intriguing book. That was her subject of her dissertation, but it's nice when you read a book about Egypt written by, she is British, but she teaches here in University of South Carolina, but she's British, and it's nice to see a book about Egypt that does not have the pyramids and mummies and museums. So we're going to talk with Professor Barnes very soon, talking about. Jessica, are you there?
Hello.
Sorry about that.
Oh, great.
Okay. Since we're a little bit late, and I do apologize, let's just get on with this. This is beautiful. It's a story. How do you write a book, or you do a research, or you things about something is so prevalent, so ingrained in people's life every minute, every day, and and you kind of try to make sense of all of this.
Well, this is actually my second book about Egypt. So my first area of research was actually all about irrigation. So that was the work that I did for my PhD thesis. And for that work, I lived in rural Egypt in Fayum province. This was way back in 2007, 2008. So I spent a lot of time with farmers who grew wheat. I also ate a lot of bread and spent a lot of time with women who baked bread and enjoyed eating their bread. And bread is something I love to eat myself. So bread and wheat were kind of lodged in my mind as interesting things. And I remember way back when I was doing my PhD research, I remember emailing my advisor and saying, oh, actually wheat seems so important. Maybe I should just look at wheat. And he said, that's a great idea. But actually then my irrigation project just I got immersed in that and had plenty to write about, just writing about water. So wheat and bread were kind of in my mind as something of interest. And then it was really the 2011 revolution, and when bread got taken up in such a kind of deeply politically significant way in the calls of the protesters for bread, freedom, and social justice. And I just felt, so many people have written about things like political rights or inequality in Egypt, and I just felt that not many people had written about bread. So I really wanted to delve into bread, and I felt that to understand bread we really had to look at the wheat from which it's made. So then the whole book project became about understanding this, as you say, very basic part of daily life, but it is actually quite complicated. A lot of the kind of logistics and things that go into people getting that bread.
You've done your study, you lived with them, you observe people. This is not a quantitative, typical academic study, anthropologists kind of are looking at, which it makes it interesting also, but it makes it very, very hard. I think you talked beautifully about the homemade experience of bread, and it was just more than just making bread. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, I really love that chapter, and I know I didn't read the whole book because I just got it yesterday, but that chapter I really delved in it, and just the story about how people make bread and the relationship with bread and all of that. And so tell us a little bit about how did you manage observing people in the rural area in the village?
Yes, well, I mean, I did it, so bread, that was exactly the story I wanted to tell, was about how bread baking, more is going on when people are baking bread than just making loaves of bread. As you say, it's about kind of communal social relations within the home. But this practice also takes place in the kind of more private parts of the home, in the real domestic space, the place that a casual visitor doesn't immediately get invited into. But it was really through building up relationships over time. So I lived for a year in this village in 2007 and 2008 and got to know some, particularly women in the village. I became good friends, and then, we'd spend a lot of time with them in their homes. And so it was really, and then I've been back a number of times since then, and I told them I was very interested in bread. I wanted to learn more about bread, and they were then very, welcoming and invited me to kind of come and watch them and spend time with them as they were baking bread. So yeah,
and I'm still. How do they look at you? Somebody coming from America. You went there as a student, 27, I think, or 25, and you said, "I want to do a story. I want to watch you guys doing this." Usually, people are a little bit leery about people not just coming from England or America, from the next village.
Yes, I mean, justifiably so. You can understand. No one wants someone to kind of come immediately, like a stranger, to come into the middle of their home. I think it was, this is really kind of a central part of how anthropologists work. So I'm in a kind of interdisciplinary program, but it's a lot about building trust and relationships. So you build those relationships first. You don't come in and say, show me how you make bread. People would feel very uncomfortable with that. But if you actually build those relationships and become, develop some trust and relationships, then people are more, people are so welcoming and happy to show you those things that they're that's really their expertise that they wanted to share with me. So time is the short answer.
It's not just, as you mentioned in your book, it's not just the fact people develop a taste to it and they have to eat it with other meals and all of that. And it is a big part. What legitimize, as you put it, legitimize you have a meal, you provide to your family. And also on a national level, Sisi will say, I'm providing to my family. And that's why they call the Sisi bread. It's kind of a government bread, wherever the case. But that sheer presence of bread on the table, that provides the security.
So I have a moment where I discuss kind of early on in the book where I talk about a man who I spoke to back in 2007 and 2008, which was a time when there were quite a lot of shortages in the supply of the government subsidized bread, which many people rely on if they don't bake their own bread. And he said to me, he told me he'd been to the bakery that morning and there hadn't been any bread left. And he said, I couldn't bring bread for my children today. They won't have anything to eat. And I was really struck by that because I don't think he meant that his children literally wouldn't eat anything all day. What he was meaning is that without bread, their meals wouldn't be complete, like there was something missing. And I think that to me kind of captures that sort of sense of insecurity that people feel when there's not bread in the house. And actually, I think I'd slightly disagree with sort of how you frame the question, that I think it does really matter the nature of the bread. Like I think people mind what the bread tastes like. So if they had a load of terrible bread in the house, they might feel just as insecure, or in the rural area, many people prefer their homemade bread and they feel kind of that's what brings them that sense of kind of security.
The city. When I left Egypt, that was during the bread riot in 77, which Sadat almost lost his job. Sadat almost escaped to Sudan because millions of people were rioting because he left the subsidy and the price of bread shooting. I remember that I couldn't even go home at the time because I'm trying to get ready to leave the next day. I could not go home because there was riots everywhere and the military came. It's a serious business. There was another revolution 2011 was, as you talked about it, and he captured that, where people were chanting عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, bread and freedom and social justice. So it's still there. I mean, they haven't figured out how you solve that problem. There is always rationing. There is always a threat. There is always a threat of insecurity of the bread. So why is it so difficult for Egyptians until today to solve this bread security?
I think that's one of the fascinating things is there's something different about the bread subsidy that the government makes the government very wary of lifting it at all, because of course the government's been rolling back all sorts of subsidies for the last 20 years or so, or even more recently, releasing a lot of subsidies. But there's something about bread that makes them very wary of kind of touching that subsidy. So I think it captures everything, like its real importance to people's daily lives, and to kind of, it does constitute kind of a major part of the caloric intake for much of the population, the poor and kind of lower middle classes. It's a big reason why people aren't going hungry. And then I think there is something sort of very symbolic about bread.
Bread in Egyptian curriculum, it's aish, it's living, it's life.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it is their livelihood.
Yeah. That the other thing I think is that for really as long as most Egyptians can remember, bread has always been there and has always been cheap, because the bread subsidy dates back to the 1940s. So if you think of the age, so as long as it is in sort of most people's memory, it's just always been there and it's always been cheap. So I think that's also part of how it's become to be so kind of cemented in people's minds. Notably the government, in terms of, you said, why can't they kind of fix it? They have made a number of changes in the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years that have addressed some of the kind of issues in the subsidy program, such that most people don't kind of complain about shortages today. Like there is mostly, you don't see huge lines at bakeries. There aren't complaints about bakeries running out. So they have made some changes that have in some ways addressed these issues.
Anything in changing in Egyptian consuming habits? They can eat frozen bread, and instead of making your own, you can buy it. I'm sure there is some of that. Is there any changing of how Egyptians eat the bread and how they look at it. You know, it has to be it has to be baked, and it has to be flat, and it has to be fresh, and it has to be hot, and it has to be is there any change in that? Because that could be, something could help relieve the crisis.
Yeah, I haven't seen any indication that that has been a key factor. I mean, one of the key changes that the government has made is they've limited the number of loaves that people can have a day. So now everyone is entitled to just 5 loaves of bread a day per person. But almost everyone I spoke to, I don't think I spoke to anyone who felt that that wasn't sufficient. So I don't think that has necessarily generated kind of people limiting their bread consumption beyond what they would otherwise choose.
Or eat in a different time, or freeze it, like when we do here. I still, if I don't have bread in my refrigerator or I feel a sense of insecurity. Until today, I live in America and I feel I don't have bread. That's a human rights issue. I need my bread. And my wife will scream, will you eat anything? We have potato, we have this. No, I need this bread, and I need my...
I may just add, the one thing that they have done is that, along with setting this limit on 5 loaves, under the new kind of electronic ration card system that the government introduced, if you don't take all of your bread, you can swap your kind of unused bread points for other subsidized goods. So you can use unused bread points for buying things like sugar at a reduced price, rice, tea, other really important things. So that creates a bit of incentive. Like, I don't think it means that people don't get bread at all, because, as you say, there is something so important about bread.
I find it very hard for somebody to go and do a very culture ingrained study if they don't know the language. So how did you manage that?
I speak Arabic. I don't want you to start switching this interview to Arabic,
that's what
but I speak Arabic. I speak Arabic.
Before you went, or had you?
Yes. No, I've studied for some time now. I spent a year studying in Damascus. And then, yes, and I've taken classes. So I speak pretty good Arabic. I can definitely, all the rural people that I work with, none of them speak a word of English. So we only converse in Arabic.
Well, that helps you sharpen your Arabic. You have to speak Arabic.
Yes, absolutely.
I'll just test your Arabic here.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
No, not testing,
ready.
But just remember, you talk about the different ways people deal with the bread, they cut it, stuff it, roll it, whatever the thing is. But molokhia, right? Have you eaten molokhia?
I have eaten molokhia.
So how do people in the village eat molokhia with homemade bread?
I suppose they might take a piece of the sometimes they use a spoon for molokhia. Like they'll eat it as a spoon, because they make it very, very liquid. Well, but then they would take off a piece of bread and then use it to kind of scoop up the molokhia, mostly.
That's very good. Now the second question: what do they call that piece of bread that they scoop the molokhia with?
Do they call it the ear of a cat? Oh yeah,
with the ear cat. This is very important, Jessica. That means you are in it. If you call your book
the ear cat. Yes, I should have done that. That would have been very good.
I would have just gone and buy the book. Things in the city. You talk a little bit about the travel, the journey of a loaf of bread, from wheat to grain to bacon to bakery to house to tabliya. By the way, that short leg table that calls tabliya. That's available. So one of the most striking things you see in the city, that guy on a bicycle delivering the bread on his head. Usually, this is an amazing skill. It should be really included in the Olympics. How the bread consumed through classes, middle class, higher class, they support different kind of bread as opposed to the village and lower class, poor, that kind of stuff. Is there it has a class connotation or connection?
Yes, I think there is definitely a class dimension to the story. Actually, one reason why I don't talk a lot about those bicycle delivery men is that my understanding is the bread they're carrying is not the subsidized bread. At least it's not in theory, because the subsidized bread is only meant to be sold from the the specific outlet. So I think it's probably the slightly whiter siahi or the shami bread that looks quite similar to baladi bread, but it's a bit different. So in my book, I kind of constrain the story to talk mostly about the baladi bread, the subsidized bread.
Okay.
So that would be one example that people who have a little bit more money in Egypt might choose to buy the shami or the siahi. There's a number of different breads that are quite similar for baladi bread, but they're made with a white flour. They have a slightly different taste, but they cost a lot more money. So that is one example. But, you know, one of the interesting things in the Egyptian context is that the population is so skewed to there's such a large chunk of the Egyptian population that actually falls within a kind of poor category. I mean, obviously you have to take these statistics with a grain of salt, but I think it's something like, you know, 20-30% are below the poverty line, which is quite a large chunk. Then something like 40% might be classified as middle class, but they are vulnerable to falling into poverty.
Yeah.
So they're certainly not affluent. And then the elite, the upper class, the rich are really just a very small, you know, maybe 10-20% of the population. So when you're looking at how many people eat this subsidized bread, it's really a story of most of the nation. I mean, it's estimated about sort of 70% of the population are eating this bread every day. So there is a class dimension, but by far the majority are. It's a majority story. And then of course, rich people, you know, more elite people, they have the money to afford other staples. So they might love bread, or they might not. They might choose to eat rice every day. Whereas in the rural area where I worked, people can't afford to eat rice every day.
You know, every country, every society has its own staple, and you address the Chinese and the rice but you address some of the experience where the Chinese try to change that. To make the rice less stable or less essential. How did that go?
Not so well. So yes, I tell account for this effort by the Chinese government to promote potatoes as a staple food. So potatoes are eaten they're only grown in part of sort of northern China. They're not a very widely eaten food. They're part of that cuisine, but they're not a sort of much loved food. And there was this very intentional promotional effort by the Chinese government to try and encourage Chinese people to eat more potatoes, to try and alleviate some of the stress, some of the security issues surrounding rice and wheat. So, but it wasn't, so to date, it has not been that successful.
You know, I mean, we could talk here all night, but it's too bad we have 25 minutes or 20 minutes show. I know that you closing this with a kind of when you revisit it years back and you reflect on the two experience and I like the passage you had there, and I don't know, I'm gonna mess it up if I read it myself. Can you read it for me about, you know, at the end you have the essence, bread is life.
Very well over the years of doing research in rural Egypt, and I talk here about the first moment I visited their house and had a meal with them. Shortly after I arrived in Warda to begin my doctoral fieldwork in 2007, Habiba's husband Khalid invited me to meet his family. Habiba welcomed me into their room for receiving guests, a small room with peeling blue paint, a bed in one corner, and a mat on the cement floor. We sat on the floor, firm cushions beside our backs, drinking tea and doing our best to converse as I struggled to understand their unfamiliar accents and they struggled to understand my imperfect Egyptian dialect. They insisted I stay for lunch and brought in a tray with bowls of cheese, chopped tomatoes, boiled eggs drizzled in oil, melon, and warm homemade bread. Thinking I'd be more comfortable eating unaccompanied, they left me with the food, alone save 2 wild cats hissing at each other and flies buzzing around. This was my first taste of the large round loaves that are made by rural women in this part of Egypt. They were delicious.
Was wonderful, really. You know, flies are our pets. We're not so I just want to point this out. Do you eat bread at home now?
I do. Unfortunately, I can't access. I wish I could access some great Arab bakeries to
really?
Eat some,
how do you get it?
Oh no, I wish I could. I can't.
Oh, I see. You don't. It was just somebody know I was gonna do this story.
Yeah.
And he said, do you know how the Egyptian security go and arrest their opposition in Cairo, in Istanbul, or the people who live abroad? They go to the Baladi bakery. Enjoy this book, and I'm going to enjoy it more. It's amazing when I see somebody get interested in people and their culture, not just a museum and mommy. Enough mommy. Much, Jessica, the assistant professor of the Department of Geology and the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment at the University of South Carolina. You wrote that book about also the Nile. It's almost the same essential stable, the Nile. And any other book? We have the bread, wheat, water. What else? You're gonna
my next project is going to be about air. Another important thing to breathe.
You're interested in basic in our life, and this is beautiful. And I think there's not enough of that. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day. I'll send you a link of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Ahmed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.